So the framework of this, first of all, it's been fascinating so far, but I'm going to dive into the United States for a little while, that's where I've spent most of my career, is paying attention to large technology companies in the United States. As a matter of fact, I was so focused on it that a year and a half or so ago, I decided to move from California to New York to get away from the large technology companies in California, because I sort of felt like I was entranced by some, bubble-like thinking, where there wasn't conversation that was lateral. And you move to New York and everything's lateral, which is awesome, particularly here at SIPA. And just teaching here has given me a new perspective, because the students ask questions that I don't think anyone even thinks of in California, because most of the students aren't from the United States. And certainly, I think I've had 2 students from California so far. So I've covered technology now for 30-some years, and that's sort of terrifying to think about. But when we launched Wired in '92, we were very much what's known as a challenger brand. The idea of the tech industry as really important to the future of the world was a challenger idea. And to think now where we are, where technology is essentially the core oxygen in the ecosystem of our economy, we haven't caught up to really understanding that. In particular, I think we haven't caught up to that as it relates to governance in the United States. And so I spent most of my career evangelizing technology. But about 7 or so years ago, that job got hard. The externalities of technology's grip on our society were starting to show through. And in the aftermath of an election that I think could be seen by the lens of history as the equivalent of the Black Sox scandal, the 2016 presidential election, I think history will not judge kindly once all the information is out about it. We have to wake up and ask ourselves, what do we do to fix the externalities of the technology industry? And that's the focus of the work that we're doing here. This is the crew. Most of the crew, some of them have moved on to greater glory, that's worked with me over the past 15 months or so. So here's that company, Facebook. I first started raising concerns in my own writing and work about the power of the tech industry in 2012. That was when it was not a particularly popular thing to do, particularly if you were a technology entrepreneur, which is what I am and was. But it came from a deeply personal experience. I had written a mostly positive book. I wrote one chapter that was asking about the consequences and externalities. I wrote this book 15 years ago about a company then that had just gone public called Google. But a new power rose after that book was published, and that was Facebook. As a matter of fact, the year that my book was published, Facebook moved to the Silicon Valley and became a significant force there. Facebook, in the years of between 2005 and 2012, first slowly and then very quickly began to eviscerate what us old internet hands used to call the open web. 2012, the year that I just mentioned, was the year that Facebook filed to go public. It was also the first full year that the company put what they called native ads into a new product that they had been pushing called the news feed. These are, the news feed is something that we all interact with, I would imagine, almost daily, either on Instagram or in Facebook. But native ads are those things that you see that look just like posts from your friends and family, but are from, Allbirds shoes if you're me. These two things, the newsfeed and native ads, and the death of the open internet, are not unrelated. I, at the time, was running a very fast-growing company. I had stars in my eyes about what that company was going to do because bankers were telling me I should. It was an open internet company, and what we did is we put native advertising in feeds, just like the newsfeed. By the time 2012 came to a close, my company that was growing at about $100 million, 40% a year, stopped growing in about 6 months. All the advertisers decided there was a better place to put their dollars, and that was the Facebook newsfeed. And the reason for that was, while both companies, mine and Facebook, had lots of engagement, lots of audience members, Facebook had something the open internet did not have. My company had thousands of blogs, if you remember those, thousands of blogs, but what we did not have was information about the users to the extent that Facebook had. Facebook had extraordinary information and had built the most amazing machine to take that data, process it, and rent it to advertisers so they could target their audience really specifically. In my case, that means apparently I need a new pair of tennis shoes. So I had a personal reason to question whether or not Facebook, a company that I was extremely optimistic about, might not be good, not just for my company, sure, but also for this idea of an open internet. Now, this was not just about Facebook, because other very large technology companies noticed what Facebook was doing. And Google in particular, which had been the king of advertising on the internet, noticed that Facebook had a better ad machine, right? Google's ad machine was extremely good. You put in a search query that told Google a lot about what you were interested in. It used that data to put an ad in front of you. But it didn't have identity. Remember, this was 8 years ago. It does now. Because you have a Gmail account, you have a YouTube account, you have a Google account, you might have 3, 4, or 5 of those accounts. And that was intentional as a response to the fact that Facebook had this new data-powered advertising machine. And so Google got into the game and plays the same game at a very high level, as did many other companies. As a matter of fact, every company that wants to succeed really needs to know who you are. And the entire ad tech advertising system, which many of the companies I've been involved with has been part of, also got into the game using third-party cookies and many other things you've probably read headlines about as being privacy negative. 2012 was the year that cemented what President Ilves mentioned earlier. Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capital. As a matter of fact, the beginning of her book opens with a scene in August of 2011. It was a very important year for the takeoff of surveillance capitalism. Our problem is that we have taken a very laissez-faire approach in the United States to regulating the technology industry, because we've been dazzled by the power of its free services and the optimism and the mission statements of its founders and the companies that have been at the fore, and the spectacular success of these companies in capital markets. $2 trillion of market cap was added by the top 5 companies in the last year alone. Microsoft, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Google. $2 trillion. So if you're an investor in those, which many people are just through standard passive index investing, that's awesome, right? But our approach to not regulating these companies has also brought with it some externalities, because we essentially handed over the governance of an entirely new asset class to those companies. And that asset class is data. Now, I bet you've all thought about data a lot over the last few years, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about here today. Big data, data breaches, data is the new oil. And another thing that you've been thinking about a lot is governance, right? But governance, as we've been discussing, as a tool of nation states, right? We've decided that we wanted to think about governance in another way. We want to think about data governance, but we want to think about the architecture of data governance that already exists, that is not being paid attention to. Because we've slouched our way into, in the United States, an architecture of data governance that has not been deeply considered by the instruments of our government. So I came to Columbia, and I had a very off-the-cuff conversation with Dean Janow in the spring of 2018. And she said, "What are you thinking about?" And I said, "I'm thinking about this thing that we're not really thinking very hard about data governance as it relates to what you know and I don't, which is governance through, nation states. But we don't understand that there already is a governance structure in place, and it's very strong and it's very established. Data is not oil. Data is non-rivalrous. Data can be shared easily, transported easily, stored easily, and when you give it to someone, you don't lose it yourself, right? But we have a governance structure right now that treats data as if it is, in fact, a rivalrous commodity. It builds walls and moats around it and silos, and it prohibits the sharing of it. In fact, I believe that our society, particularly Western capitalism, has failed to see data as an asset that could create what the economist here at Columbia, Edmund Phelps, calls mass flourishing. We are not setting data free. We are, in fact, building walls around it. We've stood back while large platform companies have built new architectures of control and new governance systems for data, and by extension for our society. And if we want to take back that control, we actually have to understand the landscape that we're currently standing in. Because society fails to build what it cannot envision. And in order to envision, you have to see where you are. 3 decades into the digital information revolution, society continues to outsource its imagination to the leaders of the tech industry, which for the most part has adopted a traditional industrial approach to governance. The bargain of the approach trades an individual's data for free services based on that data. For example, on today's internet, search results, social media, news and information are free, but they depend on the extraction of personal data as that firm's fee. And the information exchange between an individual and the service, for all intents and purposes, is locked inside of proprietary systems, enabling the service to extract maximum rent from their ability to process that data. But, and this was the idea that I shared with Dean Janow, what if that data could be shared between competing and complementary services? That's the Mapping Data Flows project's goal, is we want to raise this question by illustrating the actual architecture of our current data processing system. And I would in fact argue that we're already under a default internet constitution. This has been delivered to us by the technology firms and their enablers, which is the finance world. It's a fundamental governance document about how information flows through the internet. And it's never been ratified. It's never been debated publicly. It's very hard to read, but it is based on a discoverable corpus. And the corpus at its core are the terms of service that you click through and don't read. This is the governance model for the US internet and the data that flows through it. We actively ignore them on purpose because if you were to read every single one of the terms of service that you click OK on, it would take 76 days out of your year to read, according to research from 2018. It's probably more now. That's thanks to GDPR and CCPA, right? Of course, if we ignore this, we are ignorant of it, and we've ignored terms of service at our peril. And no one really understands them. They're written by lawyers for lawyers. I'm sorry for the lawyers in the room, but that's true. And just to be clear, they have hemmed data into silos. They're built by lawyers for their clients, who in the main, and David and I know these folks well, are engineers. And what they want is access to as much data as they can have so they can make better products and so they can make a moat around their company, which is what they're encouraged to do by the financiers who give them money to build their companies. And their business model is engagement, attention, advertising, commerce. And what ensures that? Information derived from data that can predict what someone's going to do. So I started to think about what does this architecture look like before we built mapping data flows. And it looks like this. And for any of you who may have been students of computers and computer science and early days of the technology industry, that looks like a mainframe architecture. And a mainframe architecture has dumb clients that go up to a central processing CPU in the sky. And what happens at the edge is essentially data gets pulled from those clients and services get pushed to those clients. The intelligence, the value, the processing, and the control is up in the mainframe. And this architecture, by the way, is Instagram. This architecture is Google. Just substitute the cloud for the mainframe, and we're in the same architecture right now. And as an open internet guy, that kind of drives me crazy because it's supposed to look like this. The internet was created to be a robust system where the intelligence resides not in some central place, but at the edge, right? And that idea has animated decades worth of engineers. But somehow we've managed to create a different architecture of control, particularly with these 5 largest companies. We can still learn from the internet 1.0 and imagine a scenario where that becomes the architecture of how we regulate data. But to do that, we have to understand the terms of service of the largest companies, and that's the Mapping Data Flows project. So what we decided to do is identify the 4 largest data processors in the United States that have a consumer-facing bent to them. So we left Microsoft off, and I'm starting to think we might want to throw them back in there. But for now, it's just these 4, Apple, Facebook, Google, and Amazon. And we created a map of their terms of service. So I'm going to switch over now, if I can do this with some elegance here, to a live demo. Here it is. Now, it's kind of an eye chart, and there's a lot of glare, but it's mappingdataflows.com. Please go there and leave comments and tell us what we got wrong. But first, a little bit of a setup here. What we did is we broke down the terms of service, the main ones, because they have, Amazon has what, 15, 16 terms of service, depending on, what you're using and whether you're a developer. But we took the main ones that govern consumers' interaction with the core services and the privacy policies. And we turned all of the terms in those terms of service into data. And we created a very large sheet with all those terms and broke them down into categories. You can see, well, you probably can't, but from your left to the right, the sources of the data that the companies harvest, the types of data that they harvest, and their stated purpose for taking that data, for using that data. And we had to collapse particularly the middle section, which is the types of data. There's more than 40 here, but that's actually a superset. Many of those actually have many other categories folded inside of them, because otherwise this thing would have been really, really long. But we broke all of them down into those 3 main categories, and then we added a 4th, which is the collection purpose. And we had harvested data, which is data where they're watching what you're doing. We had data that's given to you by the first party, by you. When you sign up for Facebook, you tell people your name and your favorite albums and things like that, right? And then there's third-party data that can be taken from other places and appended to your file, right? And we made all of these things searchable, and we connected all 3 of those and interact with a various number of filters, the most important one being the harvesting. This was daunting, by the way. This was not easy, and these folks did most of the hard work. Well, they did all the hard work. And thanks to the wizardry from Juan Saldarriaga, I always destroy your last name, Juan, sorry. We created this visualization, and thanks very much to the Brown Institute at Columbia Journalism for loaning him to us. I want to show you just a little bit. Here's one cut. I've got all these tabs open to show you. Here is a comparison of Amazon versus Google with data that they've used that's harvested. Amazon is in the blue, Google's in the orange. Harvested data, again, is data that the companies acquire by watching what you do as they use their services. You can see here that both companies use a lot of harvested data, and if you drill down, you can see that Google harvests demographic data. So when you click right on the link here, and you can say, okay, where's that demographic data? Boom. You can see they use demographic data, and if it's this color, it's only Google doing it, right? And they use it to power services for external businesses. What services for which businesses? Don't know. They don't say. But it raises an interesting question, and this may be why your Nest knows your age, for example. Who knows? It may be why a driverless car knows what sex you are. But where did they get that external information? The Census Bureau, probably. So what this visualization allows people to do is ask interesting questions. What it doesn't allow us to do is get to the answers exactly, but it at least creates the ability to ask the question, as opposed to trying to read tens of thousands of words of terms of service. Here's another example. This is Apple versus Facebook. Let's see, Apple is in blue and Facebook is in orange. At first you'd assume that Facebook has to collect way more data than Apple because it's Facebook and they're the big evil data collector, right? Not true. Well, one of the things we learned was Apple had one of the most liberal, and by liberal I mean they can pretty much collect whatever they want, terms of service. But it's very interesting to see that, for example, Facebook, which is in orange, has a lot more use cases for account security. But interestingly, only Apple has credit history. So if I go down to credit history here, click just on that. Apple, of course, has credit history because you're buying a very expensive thing from them. They're going to check your credit, especially if you're getting a loan, right? And what purpose can they use that for? To improve their product. What does that even mean? Right? And probably it helps them determine whether or not they're going to make a cheaper iPhone, I suppose. But their terms of service are so vague that they could use it for just about anything they want. And we actually, in the visualization, because we realized this was kind of a lot to take in, we built a few case studies up at the top that you could take a look at. And they were all written by folks up here. And this Apple case study is really fascinating, so I'm going to close with that. Apple's privacy policy states it may collect, use, transfer, and disclose non-personal information, pretty much all information besides your name and contact information, for any purpose. It collects data about everything you do, on or with your phone, everywhere you go, what apps you interact with, who you talk to the most, even your health data, and can use it for whatever they want, including advertising, and they do. They have a multi-billion-dollar app store advertising business, which they are very eager for you not to pay attention to, because they're very interested in separating themselves from Google and Facebook as not part of surveillance capitalism. But they are the platform for it. Where would they be, where would the iPhone be without Facebook and Google? Personal data can be used to create, develop, operate, deliver, and improve product, service, content, and advertising, which includes almost every purpose we identified in the visualization. So Apple may take pains to talk about how they are extremely cautious with your data, but their terms of service says they can do whatever they want. I could go on for many, many, many more hours, but time's almost up and I want some time for questions, especially for these folks. So to conclude, I want to tell you what we're doing now, because we're super excited about it. How many of you heard of the CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act? Okay. We had a thesis that all the terms of service, we took this corpus from before the act, about a year before the act was put into place, last year about this time. We assumed the terms of service must have changed dramatically in order to incorporate this new reality in the regulatory framework. It has not. We compared the documents from now to a year ago, and almost nothing's changed. How could that be? We're going to investigate that. We have some journalists working with us, and we're going to investigate what happened and how it was that the terms of service managed to actually somehow encompass new regulation before it even was enacted. The tech industry lobbyists were very involved, by the way, in the CCPA. So it's interesting. That sparked another question. What about the GDPR? So we pulled 15 years of terms of service documents from the past 15 years, and we are going to apply our visualization against an entire timeline to see how the terms of service have evolved to encompass regulatory frameworks. And we're not sure what we're going to find, but I'm excited by taking a look. And we'll have filters in the timeline slider, right, Juan? Yes. we hope to have filters in a timeline slider. So that's some of the exciting work that we're doing. And now I want to stop and let some questions, at least a few minutes of questions, because the folks here are extraordinary and they've done all of this work, and I want to thank them for what they've made possible here at SIPA. So questions? One's over here.
Hi, my name is Joe Plotkin with the Internet Society, just to get a plug in. I'm fascinated by this, and I'm going to spend hours this weekend on this thing.
By the way, we do have a Google Analytics pixel on it, and we acknowledge that. And all of this data can be downloaded and is available under a Creative Commons license.
Anyway, it's occurred to me for a long time that we seem to need a public awareness campaign about the data trails that people are leaving. And just as for instance, one of the things that sticks in my craw are restaurants that don't take cash, so you can't avoid being tracked, right? And people seem to have no awareness that every time they pay for a Starbucks with a credit card, they're being tracked. But when I look at something like this, I sort of want to throw up my hands, because how am I going to live without my iPhone? And I can't turn it off all the time, then I won't get calls. And so it seems like that as much as you could do in terms of a data hygiene public awareness campaign, this is more. I mean, you could be off Facebook. You could be, you could use a browser that's logged out of everything, or in shaded, in private mode to do your searches. But the phones are spy devices that we carry, and we seem to not be able to live without. So if somebody could address my lack of
I don't think, I mean, if you guys have anything to say about that, I mean, my first thought is this is why we need new governance approaches, because this isn't going away any more than the automobile was going to go away when it was a new thing, and for the first 10, 20, 30, 40 years it was killing a lot of people, and there weren't very good regulatory frameworks to deal with the impact of the automobile on our society. But people would say, these cars are running kids over, these cars make my neighborhood stink, these cars are a menace. But then they'd get in one and drive somewhere. And so what we need is to understand the impact of this new technology on our society and respond with appropriate, regulatory approaches. And that is the conversation we're in the midst of in the United States. It's a bit stalled, I would say, under the current administration, and may continue to be, regardless of who's, in charge in the next 4 years. But we have to begin somewhere, and so our work is about trying to at least start the roadmap. In the back.
Thank you. So this is great work, by the way, so thank you guys. But the question I have is, it sounds like you're talking about some kind of data regulations. And I guess I'm going to ask do you have any clarity around data regulations at the state level, like California's attempted, at a national level?
Well, you've downloaded and read the CCPA. When you want to respond to that?
It doesn't have the same kinds of bounds.
I mean,
Matthew?
Like John had mentioned, the one thing that we've seen so far in our research into how the CCPA at least has affected these privacy policies is that it hasn't. Or that the ways that it has been very limited, whether that's because of lobbying on behalf of the tech companies or just a general ineffectiveness of what they're trying to do. Like one of the things we saw was that it explicitly prevents the sale of your data. But companies like Facebook, go back and look at the congressional hearings, they'll say 100 times, they don't sell data. They rent access to the insights granted by data. So I tend to think that education is always the solution. We need to get not only legislators, but people more educated about what exactly it is that these companies do and how they make money. More specifically than just from data. How the insights from that data can lead to the money is going to be an important step. And whether or not it can be, we can be protected by state-level privacy laws, I don't think so. I think maybe if we did it 10 or 15 years ago, but as it stands now, we're looking more at how can we mitigate the damage that's already been done going forward, rather than how do we put the toothpaste back in the tube.
Over here.
Hello. Great work first. John, you just mentioned the automobile. Actually, just want to tell you, automobile companies collect even more data than those companies. If you read the terms of services, they collect your geolocation data, temperature, your demographic data, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be another interesting project, probably. I guess my question is, so we talk about data regulation, data privacy, and all the regulation coming out actually hurts the small companies more than those large companies. And so what would be the right kind of regulation that help us provide our data privacy? And if there's no public sector sort of government action, is there going to be a private sector solution on that? What's your thought on that?
So, as it really, you're right. Certainly, smaller companies, and you and I have both worked in those companies, have a much larger burden. They don't have, the top lobbying spenders in Washington are the top technology companies, and they have the ability to manage this kind of regulatory framework, as we just saw with CCPA and GDPR. It is very, very onerous for small companies, and it has been a net negative for innovation. But I think as in terms of what the right, I think we're not looking at the right approach. One of the things that the GDPR contemplates is data portability. And data portability is awesome, except it's useless. And it's useless if you can't actually take that data and easily take it to another service. That's called machine-readable data portability. There is no mandate for that. Were there a mandate for that, that'd be extremely negative for the business models of the large companies, because you could just take all your data from Facebook and go to a competitor, and all of a sudden VCs might start funding competitors to Facebook, because it would be super easy to move from one platform to another. So we could start there. We could start with understanding, how to take away friction in a digital economy, and create regulation that understood that. That's just one of many ideas. And then on the private sector response, there is a strong underground private sector response, and it's one of these things where I think people get a little tired of hearing these buzzwords, but at least the former president of Estonia said it before me. The public ledger and blockchain, I think, is extremely important, and most of the work done by sort of the fuzzy, crazy revolutionary types that we used to celebrate in the pages of Wired in the early days, they're working in that space now. So I look to that space as a place where things might break out. I think we probably can only take one or two more, right? Because I'm going over here in the middle.
Pick up on that point. Just to pick up on that point, if the folks here from those companies were trying to defend their position, would they say that they need exactly those types of data and those collection components in order to deliver the services that the users want? I mean, is this just for us as the users completely superfluous, or would they say, no, we need this openness here in order to give you what you want? I'm just curious what their position would be.
Oh, I would say that's definitely their position, that they need this data to do what they do, and I would argue they should have it. I would also argue that we have the right to use it ourselves and give it to anybody else we want to, which is, I think, the intent of the regulatory frameworks we've seen recently, GDPR, CCPA, and so on, and CCRP, which is coming up. CCPR? Anyways, the act that is being pushed by McTaggart now in California. But it hasn't been the net effect. Ooh, David, I'm looking forward to this one.
I just quickly want to ask you, what do you think about the fact that Zuckerberg himself has said he favors data portability? He recently said that.
Yeah.
Is that just another one of these, legal jujitsu moves where they're going to lobby to make it mean nothing?
Yes. That's my short answer. Yep. Every single head of every single tech company has now said they favor regulation, because they can't but say that. They have to now. Post-Cambridge Analytica and the election, they have to say that in the United States. But then the question is, what is the regulation? And that is the question that frankly, the students of this school and others have to take up, because I think it's critical to innovation and success in our society. All right, I think I have to stop because but I want to thank Zoe and Matthew and Veronica and Juan, who did all of this, and I just got to stand here and take some credit for it. So thank you guys very much.